Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 10th York Festival of Ideas. I believe the second one that is being done remotely. My name is Rachel Wolfe. I'm delighted to be chair of this event on levelling up the economy. I am, I'm afraid, one of those terrible people that was partly responsible for introducing levelling up into the ether as one of the authors of the 2019 Conservative Manifesto. And I'm delighted that we are going to have some wonderful panelists who are going to explain exactly what that means and what it means in policy terms. This event is the second of three looking at that question of levelling up in partnership with the Friends Provident Foundation. I'm just going to give a couple of housekeeping notes. You may have seen them on the slides. If you're watching live, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom, and you can ask questions at any time. There is also a transcript running on your Zoom, and you can switch that off at any point by pressing the CC Live transcript button. If you do have any problems, if you lose your Wi-Fi, you can always rejoin on the original link, and you can watch this back. It's being recorded on the festival YouTube channel. I am, if you would like to turn on live captioning, you can also press that CC button on your Zoom to make sure that you can read anything. Now, before I introduce our brilliant panelists, who I hope are going to switch on their videos any second, I do have one other announcement, which is unfortunately Dr. Begum is unable to come. She's had a last-minute medical emergency, but she did want to let everybody know that you can always read about the Runnymede Trust and their views, including on her Twitter handle, which is @Halima_Begum. So I'm sure that you'll all be keen to do that. Now, I am going to jump straight into the meat of the session, which is what is levelling up the economy? What does it mean? What can we all do about it? And I'm delighted to welcome our first very illustrious panelist, Martin Sambu, who is economics commentator at the Financial Times. He's been leader writer and then commentator there since 2009. He's the author of several books, including the one beautifully showcased behind him, The Economics of Belonging, which I am informed you can buy through the York Festival's bookseller, as I'm sure from any other reputable bookseller. He's been writing about economics, but also carried out research at Harvard, Columbia, and the Wharton School, and has advised governments and NGOs on natural resources and economic development. Martin, we're delighted to have you. I'm going to hand straight over to you to talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll hear from the other panelists before opening it up to discussion. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you so much. Thanks to the festival for having me. Thanks to my fellow panelists and everyone who's tuned in to watch. I do hope that next year we'll be able to meet in person, but this is still very, very good. I'm very pleased, Rachel, that you and your colleagues introduced the levelling up phrase, because it was high time that this became central to politics and not just in the UK. So I am among those people who had started to look at the numbers on regional inequality before 2019, but sort of after the big political shocks of 2016, when we were all starting we were all asking ourselves what's happening in the West, with the UK leaving the EU, with the US electing Trump, with lots of sort of backlash against the old order everywhere. My thinking about this led to the book that Rachel kindly mentioned, and I want to talk a little bit about what I learned about regional inequality in researching that book. And one fact that surprised me, and I think is still not sufficiently widely appreciated, is just how deep and how common across the Western world this phenomenon is of different parts of the country growing apart rather than growing together. So two sort of stylized facts. In pretty much every country in the industrialized West, the Western democracies, in the 3 decades after the Second World War, you would see economic growth or income growth or productivity growth being higher in the poorer places in a country. So the poorer places were catching up with the richer places, which tended to be and still tend to be the capital cities or other big economic centers. But you had convergence. We all know that inequality between individuals fell in that period, but inequality between places fell strongly and pretty much everywhere. in those 3 decades. And then again, pretty much everywhere around 1980, that changed. In most places, that stagnated. So in the 3-4 decades since 1980, you've either had no relationship between how poor a place is and how fast it grows, or it's even gone into reverse, so that poorer places grow more slowly than richer places. Again, with very, very few exceptions, we see this in North America and in Europe. And I think it's a fundamental part of the very difficult politics and very strange politics we've had over the last 10 years or so. The economic geographer, the professor of economic geographer at LSE, Andres Rodriguez Pose, has a very nice phrase for this. He calls the populist upheavals that we've seen in so many places, he calls them the revenge of the places that don't matter. It's a bit of a harsh phrase, places that don't matter, but I think it kind of captures how people often feel that they've sort of been left neglected. And in many cases, they are right. So starting with that and pointing out that it's happened pretty much everywhere, we want to ask why before we can answer what to do about it. So it's kind of striking how synchronized it seems to be. Around 1980, give or take 5 years, that's sort of when this convergence flipped into divergence. 1980 also happens to be, in all of these countries, pretty much the year when the number of factory jobs peaked. So I think deindustrialization has a big role to play in explaining this, but perhaps not in the way we are accustomed to thinking about it. In every Western country, the share of factory workers has been going down for decades and decades, including from the war, basically, even before in some places. But the absolute number was rising. The absolute number of hands on the conveyor belt, if you like, was rising in the US, in the UK, in most of industrialized Europe, up until the 70s. And then sort of give or take 5 years, around 1980, you saw the peak, and then you saw the fall. And of course, there's been no shortage of anthropological analyses, economic analysis, sociological analysis, and of course, artistic and literary renderings of the end of industry and what that's done to places that lived well in an industrial economy. But I think it's very often misinterpreted. It's often blamed on globalization. Globalization arrived, the Chinese or other Asian countries took our jobs away, and look what's happened. It's a narrative that you've heard very much from people like Donald Trump. It's tempting to believe. It sort of gives sense to things, and it proposes a very easy solution: throw the borders up, and you'll bring the jobs back. But that's very wrong, and it's wrong because of another very important fact that also isn't sufficiently well known. So here's my last sort of economic fact that we need to know about. Industrial jobs fell, or industrial employment fell. Industry didn't. Industrial production didn't. In every Western country, industrial production continued to increase in the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s. If we look at just the volume of stuff produced, the US produces more cars than it has ever produced. Of course, some sectors disappeared, in particular the low productivity ones. Textiles went to Asia. But overall, industrial production volumes kept increasing, falling in recessions, coming back after recessions. So pretty much everywhere, it was sort of flat when China entered the world trading system in the early 2000s. But the industry is there. It's just that it doesn't need the workers anymore. I think this is a very important truth that basically tells you it's not globalization. It's because of technological change, productivity change. You can produce stuff with fewer people. But it also tells you that any hope for regeneration in places that have been left behind, to make the poorer places more prosperous, it's not going to happen by an expansion of factory jobs. To the extent that you bring more industry to a place, the jobs that will be worth having will be very highly productive jobs, which by definition there won't be that many of. That's what high labor productivity means. So that's a thought we have to kind of leave behind us. Now, why has this change in industrial structure, or I should say in economic structure, from industry towards knowledge services, which are now the most valuable sectors in the economy. Why has that had this regional impact? Well, it's because different kinds of economic sectors thrive in different kinds of places. A factory can be run at an optimal scale in a town or a small city. So the industrial economy was just almost by chance very good for spreading prosperity across a national territory. You could kind of have a bit of industry in most places. The service industries, the knowledge service industries are not like that. They tend to be very agglomerative. They thrive in big churning metropolises, right? Where there's a lot of workers with the same skills, where there's a lot of chance meetings where ideas are sparked and so on. But the point is that the new economic structure, which produces more GDP, more growth, tends to do particularly well in the biggest cities. And I think that's, in a nutshell, that's the story. That tells you what's happened. It also tells you why it's going to be awfully hard to level up. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but we should be, have very open eyes about how hard it is. Because what we need to do, I think, is to make this modern kind of economy, the one based around knowledge services, including high-tech, high-knowledge manufacturing, but mostly services. We have to make that work for more places. That, I think, is the key challenge. It's very hard to do. It's not impossible, and we know it's not impossible because there are examples of places that have been turned around in countries that have seen increasing regional inequality. One example I'm quite fond of is Grand Rapids in Michigan in the US, which I can talk about in discussion later on. There are also some countries which have managed to keep regional differences contained. Norway is one of them. There aren't many, but there are some, and we can talk a bit about what they've done. But the overall goal has to be not to kind of restore something that existed in the past, because it's not going to exist again. It is to find ways for the most productive, leading parts of the economy to work well in places outside of the big metropolis of places like London, places like New York, and so on. Now, how do you do that? Where do we begin? A key message here is that a lot of things have to go right at the same time. So you need for places to be connected. You need infrastructure. You need physical infrastructure. You need digital infrastructure. You need social infrastructure. You need people to have contact with the economic centers. But you also need, and I hope Rachel at some point will step out of her moderator role and talk about this because she's written about it. You need places to be attractive, to be livable, to be nice places where people who can take the fancy knowledge-based jobs that are now in the big cities, that would take them if they were available in a smaller place. Those places need to be attractive enough, to be nice enough to live in, to attract the people who have a choice. Because a big, unfortunately, a sort of sad aspect of regional inequality is that the people from struggling places who are as talented from nature's side as anyone else are forced to go to the big economic centers in order to pursue their talents and get the best jobs they can. So part of the solution will have to be people having the choice to get those jobs in more places. I mentioned that there's agglomeration effects in these knowledge service industries. That means that there's an important role for government here. What has worked in the places that have succeeded in turning around is that you've been able to put together a critical mass of knowledge jobs, enough that you can then attract more knowledge jobs on top of that. So I mentioned Grand Rapids as an example. This is a place that was very manufacturing heavy, suffered from the manufacturing recessions in the US, and then managed to turn around by combining the location of a medical university campus with government services to help local manufacturers go into very high-tech medical manufacturing. So you have examples of a plastics manufacturing going into medical packaging, for example, or car mechanical companies car mechanics or car part producers going into medical devices, artificial limbs production, that sort of thing. That's the sort of thing you see in places where this has worked. You manage to plant something that's big enough to start a local services, knowledge services sector that then becomes self-sustained and attracts more people to move in. This takes money, but it takes more than that. It takes a sort of guiding intelligence. It takes, I almost want to say planning, but I don't mean planning in the old socialist sense, but it needs local government in particular, but also central government to think together about a sort of direction they want private agents to coordinate on. So you probably do need to not pick winners in a company sense, not pick companies you think will be successful, but to pick some areas that are particularly ripe for a transformation. If you give them a lot of resources, if you coordinate all the different things that have to go well, and if you accept that what this means is not to go back to some ideal past, but to create something very new and something, dare I say it, a bit more urban and metropolitan in more but somewhat smaller places. I will just stop there. This is really the opening of a discussion. My main point really is that this is a very common problem. It's one that has has a very deep cause. That doesn't mean we can't address it, but it's very hard and a lot of things have to be done right at the same time. So I will say that as a sort of general point, and I'm sure we will get into some more concrete details in discussion. But for now, thanks very much for your attention.
Martin, thank you. That was fascinating. And I have 20 or more questions that could easily take up the entire time of this. So I'm going to try and focus on one. Because the sort of agglomeration effect that you've described has sort of been quite well documented, including in your book, but in others. But there's been sort of two things that have been talked about a lot in the last year or so. The first, longer than the last year, is how much AI and automation is going to accelerate some of the effects that you've been talking about in terms of productivity of jobs, but also productivity of the traditional knowledge economy. And are some of those jobs going to disappear? And what might that mean? The second is the sort of anti-agglomeration narrative. It's the idea that post-COVID, actually, we're not all going to stay in cities anymore. We're going to work from home. A lot of the spending is going to happen in smaller places. That a lot of these effects that we've kind of assumed drove Silicon Valley or New York or London are going to be diluted. Do you buy that? And do you think that changes your fundamental view of what needs to be done or not?
Yeah, really good questions. Look, on the first one, I will simply say that we should always embrace productivity. Productivity is what can make us richer. It's what can make jobs be paid better. We want productivity. So we want productivity in manufacturing, which means we want few manufacturing jobs, not many. And if there's productivity increases in the services sectors, that would be great too. Now, I've talked about the sort of high knowledge services, knowledge intensive services, lawyering and accounting and logistics planning and programming and all of these things. Finance and banking has its own problems. I should, of course, mention journalism. But of course, there are a lot of other service jobs, and the UK, like the US, has a problem in that many of those service jobs, the more sort of manual services, are hugely unproductive. Basically because either the laws or the enforcement of the laws around wage and employment standards have been so weak that it's been economical for businesses to choose to employ a lot of low productivity labor intensively. I think in services, we want to generally, everywhere, we want generally to try to make the low productivity jobs prohibitively expensive for companies so that they choose more high productivity business models. Your second question was about COVID. I think you're quite right that something could change here. I don't think that changes so much my view about what is necessary, because I think whether or not working from home, remote working in the high knowledge services, knowledge intensive services, becomes this sort of big watershed, it's going to depend on policy. So if the policy of the government, which is my impression that is the policy of this government, is to get people back to the cities, back to the offices as soon as possible, well, that is not trying to make things change because of these technologies we've learned how to use, right? An alternative is what it seems like Ireland is trying to do, which is to say, look, we've all learned, or people in these good jobs have all learned to work from home, work remotely. We want to promote that. We're going to put in place incentives, tax credits. We will put in place the infrastructure. We will promote the creation of temporary workspaces for those times you do need to meet in the city, in order for more people to choose to do these jobs in smaller places. So I don't think it changes what needs to be done, because the opportunity is only there if policy chooses to make use of it. But I think there is a greater opportunity than there was before.
And just to understand, so your view would be if levelling up from a regional productivity and growth point of view was the aim, you would go down Ireland's direction, not the UK.
Yes. Okay. Although I don't get the sense that the UK has really made up its mind in a very firm way on this yet.
No, I think that's fair. I still have many more questions, but I am going to stop there because I am very keen to bring in Catherine Anenkel, who is a senior analyst at the Centre of Cities for Cities. So I suspect she is also going to talk about cities and their importance a fair bit. She's interested, and I'm sure we'll talk about all urban topics. So not only the economy, but high streets, transport, innovation. Before she joined the Centre for Cities, she worked for Technopolis Group, which is a public sector consultancy working on innovation industrial policies for German ministries, which remain in our minds the archetype of competence. So I'm sure she'll have lots to say. I'm delighted to welcome Catherine. She's going to share some slides. So as soon as she's done that, I will stop my video and let her talk about levelling up from a city point of view.
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks a lot that you think that Germany is the archetype of many things. I'm often not sure about it, but yeah, let's start with my presentation, which is the role of levelling up for the UK, and particularly for big cities. I will focus on what should be considered in the upcoming levelling up white paper, and also what the particular role of large cities and towns could be. So I think the first question we must think about when we talk about leveling up is actually what do we want to level up? And what we can see here is the map for the UK, of the UK for 3 indicators: skills, health, and productivity. And we can see that there is actually a large variation across the entire country. And so sure, when we think about leveling up, our gut reaction of seeing the maps with all the differences is that probably we should simply get rid of the variation. But that can be probably possible for skills and health, and should be, because there is no justification why persons in Grimsby have actually worse health than, for instance, a large share of people in Reading, etc. But it will be difficult to expect that all places across the UK can achieve or have the same productivity in the same place. So we cannot expect that rural places in Wales has the similar productivity than central Manchester. And I think this is picking up a lot of points, and Martin has already mentioned, the importance of cities when it comes for this one indicator of productivity. So we would actually, when we think from that perspective, expect for productivity a variation across the country, and because places have a different productivity potential. When it comes then to leveling up productivity, it is, as I already said, and as already Martin has mentioned, and it's particularly cities which have the higher potential to be productive, because they're attractive for very productive businesses, the high-skilled service industries Martin has mentioned, and for 3 reasons. First, cities and city centers offer learning, and they're dense and give businesses the ability to exchange ideas and information. That's also called knowledge spillovers, sharing. Cities give the ability to share input supply chains, and be just the transport system, which is very dense in cities and connecting a lot of people, office buildings, which host a lot of different companies. And for sure, it's not only that, it's also matching So in the cities and big city centers, you find a very high share of high-skilled people, which are suitable for any knowledge-intensive jobs. So, and for these three reasons, as you can see on the right-hand side, cities and city centers locations look very special. They attract productive businesses, as indicated, with a high demand for office space in the top, and also have the highest share of high-skilled workers. So, but why am I talking about the framework of leveling up? So the problem is that currently in the UK, cities outside of the Greater Southeast don't follow the theory I've just mentioned. So you can see here the productivity by three different geographies for the Greater Southeast on the left, and elsewhere in Great Britain on the right. And you can also see, well, productivity in rural areas in the Greater Southeast and outside of the Greater Southeast is like relatively equal. And this cannot be said for cities. So cities in the Greater Southeast are much more productive than elsewhere in Great Britain. And this is particularly the point where we need to level up when it comes to productivity. And it's not only a problem that cities in general outside the Greater Southeast are underperforming. It is particularly a problem that the biggest cities in the UK are underperforming. So we know from other countries the productivity of the city should increase with its size. It's basically because of the agglomeration effects I've mentioned earlier. And we see, for instance, in the US, Germany, and France, that the bigger the city, the bigger its productivity because of this agglomeration effect. But as you can see here in this figure, which is looking at the relationship between city size and its productivity, and when in a perfect world in the UK, all cities should sit on the line. It is particularly Manchester and Birmingham that are underperforming. And there's actually no reason why Manchester or Birmingham should be less productive than their international counterparts in Germany, Cologne, Frankfurt, France, Toulouse. They sit all on the line, and Birmingham and Manchester should also sit on the line. So if you would do the analysis from the previous slide for all places, in all places in the UK, you would actually see that large cities have are the largest contributors of this productivity gap here. You can see that it's almost 60 billion pound a year which get lost because of the underperformance of the 8 largest cities in the UK. And this is because of their sheer size they have. And when we look at it from the other perspective, it does also means that all these people living in the big cities are affected by the lack of productivity of these places. So in percentages, that's more than half of the lost potential, despite the large cities only covered around 7% of the land outside of the Greater Southeast. And that means that if we want to level up the economy, we must tackle the underperformance of cities, particularly the big cities, Manchester, Glasgow, and Birmingham. So what we would like to see in the upcoming white paper of the government would be basically 3 broad points. First, that the share of people without the equivalent of 5 good GCSEs to the national average in every local authority that currently sits above it. So that means it's independent, whether it's a city, a town, and it should be everywhere that skills should be in the focus. Then that life expectancy is increased to the national average in every local authority that currently sits below it, and also everywhere in the UK. And then bringing all lagging places back up to their productivity potential, with a particular focus on raising the contribution of the UK's largest cities and towns, Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, but also some others. So how do we think that would look like when it comes to policy in the different geographies? So skills in improving the quality of public services should be addressed in all 4 geographies: deep rural, city surrounds, suburbs, and centers. Access to jobs, for instance, due to transport, mainly in areas where it is possible. So it's probably very difficult to connect people in extremely deep rural areas to these city center jobs. But in the city surroundings, city suburbs and centers, there are certainly things can be done. And I said productivity, particularly in city suburbs and city centers. What that means specifically, which policy areas should be in the focus, should be first skills, with a particular focus on improving basic and intermediate skills. Second, devolution, so devolve the power to a reformed local government with more powers. And then the third one, where am I? Increase the quality of public services. Fourth, local public transport. And the last point, very important, particularly for the big cities, would be focusing on city centers to increase the productivity of these places. Yeah, I think that was it from my side.
Catherine, thank you. And thank you for the presentation. I'm just going to ask one question, if I may. As I understood from your last couple of slides, what you were saying was basically, there are some interventions you should do everywhere. You should make people better educated. You should make sure that public services are working better. But if productivity is your aim, you need to focus on city centres and then kind of moving out. So if I took somewhere like Oldham, say, since you focused on Manchester, what do you think sensible policy would mean for people in Oldham in what kind of time frame? What would you be saying to them would be the result of getting this right?
So Oldham, part of Greater Manchester, and as far as I remember or recall, skills levels are rather low there, so the people have not the access to these jobs. So for sure, first interventions should be on focusing skills, increasing skills for these people to allow participation on the labor market. I don't have in mind now, or I don't really know about the transport connections, but I know...
Feel free to choose a random place. I was just saying, you know, somewhere that feels like a town, quite run down, definitely a kind of leveling up area, but actually in one of these bigger city geographies.
I think skills, it's the one and only measure which must be addressed. And I think the problem is there that skills at the moment, they're very much focused on high skilled jobs, etc. But it's basically also increasing the basic skills of the population. So allowing access to the jobs would already make a big difference, and also would make Manchester probably much more attractive for businesses. Manchester has seen a strong increase of success during the last years, but for sure, if there are more people which have high skills, that would already be a big success. I mean, it's more difficult, I think, than for places which are really remote. I think allowing people to get the skills they need is very important there. But then for sure, the transport links to productive jobs may simply be too difficult for them.
Catherine, thank you. I'm now going to ask a slightly unfair question, but it leads into, I think, Charlie's speech. So as many of the participants may be aware, there's a bit of a kind of fight going on in the education world right now about whether we should be continuing funding university and degree level courses to the extent that we have done in the past, or whether more of that money should be diverted into sub-degree and lower level skills for these kinds of people and people who are not graduate. And there's a skills bill that's just started to go through Parliament that is designed to create this kind of lifelong learning process, which would probably in effect divert some of that money. Do you think that's a good thing for a levelling up point of view or not?
So I do not know many of the details of this paper or the bill, but what I know is that definitely lifelong learning and further education should be in the focus, because actually that is the problem the UK has. I did like a comparative analysis with like other big cities like Germany, France, and the UK, and the levels of people with low skills is extremely high in these places. So reskilling and giving just the basic skills is definitely the right way forward. But what we also know is that a lot of people who would actually benefit from being upskilled, reskilled, further educated, whatever, they don't really have access to these opportunities. So whatever finally will come into force or will be launched and decided on must also really think about the way how the upskilling or further education is coming to the people who need it, because often they don't know it, they don't know how to access it. So it's also like for sure a very large capacity and institutional question.
Catherine, thank you. And that is a perfect segue into our last speaker, who will give a spirited defense of universities and their role, I'm quite sure. Professor Charlie Jeffrey is Vice-Chancellor and President at the University of York, joining in 2019, so just in time for the two remote festivals, from the University of Edinburgh, where he was Senior Vice Principal. Appropriately enough, his academic background is the study of politics, and I know he's going to talk about the role that universities can play in bringing benefit to their local areas through research and also through education and widening access. I'm delighted to welcome him, and I will pass over to him for his remarks.
Thank you very much indeed, Rachel. Great to be here. I wanted to spend a moment or two thinking about what levelling up means. It's a term which is very much in vogue, not least due to your efforts, but it's used to mean a number of different things. I think fundamentally it has to be about opening up opportunity, but I think you can see that in two ways. One is geographical, and Martin was very clear on this, and Catherine also. And essentially in the UK, it's about rebalancing the economy so that other parts of it beyond London and the South East are supported. But there is an individual level as well. Levelling up has to be about opening out opportunity at the individual level. Now, there's quite a bit of correspondence between the geographical and the individual. It's not perfect. But often individual economic opportunity is limited in places which are also disadvantaged. There's a huge amount of urgency about this now. Obviously, COVID has disrupted the economy, and COVID in particular has exacerbated existing inequalities of opportunity. So if you were a disadvantaged place or a disadvantaged individual before COVID, you're probably more disadvantaged now. We also have the post-Brexit realignment of the UK to deal with. We have removed economic advantages through leaving the EU. We're not yet fully clear about the economic advantages that will replace them, the new opportunities that will emerge outside of the EU. We have more work to do there. We also have an overriding ambition and need to move to net zero, big theme this year with COP26. We really need to move that debate away from the cost of transition to the opportunity of transition. My organisation is committed to being net zero by 2030. Many other organisations are, many countries are saying 2050 or whatever their target is. That's a huge transition which requires science, technology, economy, society to move in enormous ways. And that's a business opportunity. That people will make money out of this. We need to think of that opportunity. Finally, the UK has, comparatively speaking, a productivity deficit. We are less productive than some of the countries we like to compare ourselves with. And that compounds all of those other things. Low productivity roles are the ones which have been most disrupted in many cases by COVID. Low productivity prevents us from developing areas of international comparative advantage where the UK is the best at something. It's very hard to do that if you're working at low productivity. And higher productivity will be absolutely vital in exploiting the opportunities of net zero and that low carbon transition. So what's the relevance of universities to all of that? And two or three areas. The first is that universities are the future economy. We are the future economy. Every widget, gadget, application in use in the public and the private sectors rests on knowledge discovered, honed, and developed for application at universities. These are the things which help existing businesses to adapt and to modernize. These are the things which open up new economic sectors, new potential. Universities are the economic future. Secondly, they produce graduates. This is the skills agenda that Katrine was talking about. Our graduates carry that new knowledge, the applications of that knowledge with them into the economy. We talk an awful lot about the commercialization of our research at universities. We don't think enough of graduates as the agents of that commercialization as they take what they learn into their careers. Now, all of this has a diffuse impact on the general economic fabric, and frankly, far too much of it has been sucked into London and the southeast in the past. But alongside that diffuse impact, there is also lots of local and regional impact. You find dynamic clusters of economic activity around universities which reflect their contributions to those discoveries. That's a route to geographic levelling up if we can harness that capability of universities to anchor innovation in their places. The universities should also be interested in their impact at the individual level. I think it's an obligation for universities to think about their impact at the individual level. Many universities, mine included, have a sense of civic mission, expressed in part in a commitment to widening access, developed through local collaborations of all kinds. And all of that empowers participation in the new economic opportunities which grow up around universities because of that discovery, because of that role in the future economy. Let me give a couple of examples from the University of York, and most universities could do the same. I'm just going to focus on my own for obvious reasons. The first is around the bioeconomy. We have at the University of York a long-term scientific excellence in the field of biotechnology, which has increasing industrial applications. One of my brilliant colleagues calls this essentially the transition from crude oil to crude sugar, from using oil to make energy, using oil to make plastics and other products, to using the products of agriculture to do this, and the starches that we grow in agriculture, and the starches that we tend to throw away now in our food systems. We have an opportunity to make airline fuels, to make plastics, whatever it is, from sugar grown through agriculture. We also have an opportunity to make agriculture more efficient through the technological modernization of agriculture, the application of new genetic techniques, new robotics techniques, and so on. And you see in a place like York and around York, the incremental development of an ecosystem which has begun to apply that science to the economy. You see existing companies, existing industries, chemicals, energy, food, adopting these new technologies and making it part of their future. You also see new company formation, innovative ideas coming out of universities, coming out of people who are attracted to the context that universities provide, which then become part of the supply chains for those bigger existing companies. You see a scaling up process over time. We think at the moment at the University of York, there's about 250 million of private investment ready to be pumped in addition to all of that that's gone before, into those industries. That's an example of comparative advantage. We can do that better here in and around York because we have the preconditions for it that have grown up around the university. Fantastic contribution to net zero if we move away from hydrocarbons as the source of energy and products. Fantastic opportunity to raise productivity, both in the rural economy, but also in places like the Humber, which have traded on energy and chemicals and found that the old ways of doing things, the old markets are going. It's an opportunity for renewal. And crucially, you can't do all of that in London because London doesn't have the rural area. It doesn't have that capability that we have traditionally around the Humber. That's geographical levelling up. Has to be about individual opportunity too. That's where the civic responsibility that most universities will proclaim comes in. We have a fantastic collaboration in York, 2 universities in this city, 2 higher education colleges. We've worked together to produce a skills strategy for the city council to adopt. Earlier this morning, going back to what you were saying, Rachel, about further and higher education, I was at a local further education college thinking about how we and they can work together to ensure the skills supply at different levels that will support the growth of these new industries. We have to extend that back into school education as well. We have a fantastic collaboration with the University of Hull and a charity called Into University, which is all about establishing mechanisms to raise understanding of the possibilities of education in some of our most disadvantaged areas, in Hull, in Grimsby, in Scarborough, all with really difficult indicators of disadvantage. So we're working to build the early interventions which can build the confidence of schools, of parents, in a route which leads to university, boosting the flow of students from underrepresented backgrounds. Now, there's a sweet spot there that we need to aim for, and it's about getting an ecosystem to work which both stimulates innovation and that economic transformation and that geographic rebalancing, but does so in an inclusive way, which opens up access to that transformed economy to individuals who might not otherwise have the chance. So that's what I think, Rachel, universities can do in levelling up.
Charlie, thank you. I am also going to ask you one question, if I may, which is actually going to be built from one of the questions in the Q&A. So thank you for everyone who's been asking questions, and I hope more will. One of the kind of increasing political, by which I mean sort of Westminster narratives recently, is that there is an inherent tension between net zero and levelling up. That if you want to pursue net zero, it's going to cost lots of people lots of money. And exactly the sorts of people that voted for the Conservative government and a levelling up agenda are the ones who are sort of going to be least supportive of this move. I thought what was very interesting in your discussion of your work at the university was how you see the university as effectively using research around net zero and climate change to also create investment and export opportunities. Do you see these in tension? I think the question was, does pursuing net zero mean we have to stop worrying about economics and stop growing, or not?
I think not. If we are going to achieve net zero on these timescales we're all talking about, my university by 2030, I can't remember the exact date the UK is aiming for now, but it's not too much later than that. We're not going to do it unless we stimulate economic activity which is directed at it. And I think you can see it now, that companies are adapting what they do, moving away from old ways of doing things, developing new products, using different source materials. New companies are emerging with ideas about how you can accelerate that process towards net zero and make money out of it. I don't think we'll ever meet net zero targets unless we see a massive growth of private sector activity, which is designed to make money out of that process. I don't think you can ordain it. I don't think you can regulate it. And perhaps that's the issue underlying your question, because we have heard a lot about regulation. We must reduce emissions. We must stop cars of certain vintages or certain fuel types from coming into cities. These are barriers. I think there are a huge amount of opportunities as well. And perhaps that's one of those things the government could think about in shifting the debate onto the opportunity and away from the negatives of regulation.
Well, I think what's very noticeable about the government, I don't know if you agree, is that they have made a lot of their rhetoric about the opportunity. What they haven't quite yet done is had all the policies and strategies that back up that rhetoric. But they've promised jobs, right? They've tried quite hard to align those two narratives. I'm going to bring back Martin and Catherine, if I may, and just have a bit of a general discussion, and then I'll start asking some of the questions that have come through in the Q&A. I think my first question to all of you is in two parts. So the first part of the question is, if you were the government right now and you wanted to do one thing to support levelling up economically, I think we've defined it as somewhat economically in this session, what would it be? And then my second part is, do you see as tension between that thing and the political reality, which is that governments work on relatively short political timescales? They need to get re-elected. They need to get permission from the electorate to continue on whatever it is that they're doing. And therefore, there's always a demand for some short-term results. So I'm going to go to Martin first. I hope the two parts of my question made sense, and then Catherine, and then Charlie.
Yeah, if I understand it right, it's the second question is why my answer to the first question is wrong, in a sense, isn't that?
Well, they may align perfectly. Let's see.
My first question, in a sense, I think I already gave one answer to that. I think in the very short run, a good idea would be to use the jump to remote working that so many of us have been forced to take or make, and make that more permanent, and try to use it as a very conscious tool to shift some of these high-paying, high-skills, knowledge-intensive jobs out of London, maybe out of some of the other big cities, towards smaller places, but to have a framework and a set of incentives in place to try to sort of slightly engineer a kind of short-term gain, at least, for more of these jobs to be doable from more places. And, you know, let me add sort of half an idea to that, because one thing that comes out of that is, one, that some of those jobs now will be in other places. That's itself leveling up. But it also means that more purchasing power will be spent locally. Right? And I think we haven't really mentioned it yet, but I think that's a huge part of this, that you just there needs to be, if a place becomes too poor or is impoverished too fast, you get this downward spiral. People don't have jobs, they don't spend, other people lose their jobs, and nothing is sustained anymore. You need to do the reverse of that. And that means get more money into the places we care about. Shifting the jobs is one way. I think that the government will actually have to start spending, thinking about placing more serious amounts of money into the places it wants to level up, which ultimately means less will go to richer places. But at the moment, there's no need to cut back on anything at all. Spend like hell at the moment, but especially in those places. Is that politically realistic? I think both of those things are politically perfectly feasible, unless you are chained to a narrative that we need to normalize and get back to life the way it was before March 2020, which you sometimes hear, especially from the Treasury and the Chancellor, and also sometimes from the Prime Minister. We need to find our freedoms again, right? And there's this sort of sense that means getting back to the way things were, while at the same time the government was elected, went to the polls as a transformation government. Things should not be the same as before. So, given that, the government has the credibility to say, well, here are actually some things that we won't return to the status quo ante. So, use this disruption. Don't let a crisis go to waste.
And I guess the reason for that is because they are worried about all of the shops in central cities and all the stuff that relies on central cities and the businesses and the real estate. And they are worried about the transition costs, if nothing else, including the tax take transition costs of all of this starting to disappear. Is your view basically just stop worrying?
That's a legitimate worry. I mean, I think it's not only about the transition, but just about those jobs that are there. But of course, those jobs are there because the most high value added activity is concentrated there. So if you had more of the highest value added jobs in other places, those auxiliary jobs would also move there. And I know you know this, Rachel, because I think you've mentioned it in some of your writing, but you look at focus groups and polling and so on in left behind places. You ask, what do you want now? And right at the top, people very often mention, we want nice high streets, right? And that means the sort of jobs that we get. I live in Stoke Newington in London. We have a wonderful high street here, and I understand that's the sort of thing. It's nice to live in a place like that. And if those jobs, some of those shops move, yes, of course, there's a transition, and certainly how you tax needs to be thought about. But if some of those things move to other places, that is leveling up, isn't it?
I mean, I agree with that, and it is the thing that comes up again and again, and indeed the fact that people miss the high streets they feel they had not so long ago. It is not just that we want what these other places have, but we feel we are in decline, that they want to be reversed. Catherine, what's your view of that? Both my original question, what's the one thing that you would do if you were dictator of the country right now, and how you've managed that politically? But also Martin's point, is the era of cities and agglomeration and working patterns kind of fading a little?
Thanks, Rachel. I would like to start with the letter. I find it very interesting that leveling up is to be thought to be reached by suddenly everyone moving somewhere to work from home. And I think some things to consider. First, we've already seen that a lot of the productive businesses are actually calling their workers back to the office, like the big banks, and they're already started with it. So there seem to be some industries which are highly reluctant to do it. Then the point Martin mentioned, that people could move to these desperate places to live there and to bring the demand into these places. I mean, I think we all know how some of these places are actually look like. They're not only disadvantaged because the people have no access to jobs, they may also be disadvantaged because the housing structure is very bad. It's simply not the surrounding. A lot of people would like to live there. So a lot of people have actually not opted to live there. So why would suddenly a banker with like a really, really high income move to a very remote place, which is totally run down? Probably he will move to a town, which is actually pretty good to looking, nice, and actually not in the need for leveling up. Probably if you can and would not need to return to the office, you would probably move to, I don't know, Dartmouth or Salcombe, etc., places which are already really, really rich. So I'm not sure how this could actually benefit disused place, or like places which are not doing very well. And another point to look at is that I think a lot of people, they will return to the office from time to time, be it just twice a week, be it 3 times a week. But I think there are not many industries which tell their workers, please stay wherever you are and work from there and never return. So I think this can be, some industries do this already, like tech, etc. But it's a tiny, tiny, tiny share. For the rest of the people, they may be in the office for two days. What does it mean then? Probably it's just the commuter belt, which is increasing a lot around these places like London, which are already agglomerations. This could be maybe a good thing, for instance, for Hastings. Hastings at the moment, it's too far away to actually commute there every day to London. It's pretty nice already. But now if you only have to commute to the office twice a week, you will probably move to Hastings. So maybe for those towns, there's hope, but still there must be somehow in the reach of a city which has this productive jobs. So I think for that reason, or the reasons I've mentioned, this working from home thing can only benefit some places, selected places, probably all in the background of London. And we don't need to level up the greater southeast. We actually need to focus on the north. And it's highly unlikely that that the person in a productive job is moving somewhere in a remote area in the north. So what I would do is basically what I've already said in the beginning. So short-term measures should, even though when you cannot see the benefits, directly focus on education so that these people in the remote places can access the skills to access these labor markets. What you could do, for instance, is to make it more visible that there is actually, that you can do something. You could give people vouchers, like a certain budget for people which do not have sufficient degrees to access certain further qualifications, etc. And that has been already done in Singapore. So there are like successful places who have done this. So that would mean people who do not have the education which is needed would get really financial incentives, and they are not there anymore for people who already have the skills. So this would be my idea for leveling up.
First of all, I am so delighted there's a disagreement, because that always makes for a much more interesting panel. So thank you. And I hope we'll come back to this in a minute. I am going to go to Charlie, and then I will start bringing in a couple of the questions from the Q&A. Charlie, your one thing.
The one thing, well, lavish government investment in the University of York would be, more seriously. I think that the government needs to think very, very hard about policy in this space, and to think about ecosystems in a way that it currently doesn't. For example, and you mentioned this earlier, setting up further education against higher education. That's absolutely crazy. If you want to build future industries or future-proof current industries, you're going to need talent at different skill levels. It's not one or the other. It's both, and it's absolutely crazy. I work very closely with the FE colleges in York, because we do different and complementary things, and I think that's an issue that I would hope our government might recognise more fully, and do this very elusive thing, which I used to lecture about probably 20 years ago, and that's joined up government. Government still doesn't join up terribly well, but if we want to level up, we need BEIS, we need DEFRA, we need the Department for Education, we need the Department for International Trade to have a shared understanding of the policy challenge and how to address it. And frankly, no government is yet very good at that, including the current one. Tension with the political timescale. Well, I think there is one really, really important tension. If you want to level up, you have to invest. Whatever the policy levers are, you're going to have to invest in them. And we've just gone through a period, or still going through a period, of extraordinarily high public expenditure. About the worst thing the government could do, but one that I think it will be strongly tempted to do and perhaps pressed to do, is to really, really reduce public expenditure in areas where it thinks it can save money. That will be a false economy, because you won't get that joining up you need across the functions of different departments. If you say, well, we can take a few billion out of that budget here and there, you probably need a much more subtle way of managing the public finances, which doesn't follow the old rules. Austerity, as per after the 2008 crash, would be a disaster now. And I think government has to manage that tension. Can't spend at the current levels, clearly, indefinitely, but it's got to be ready to invest and not to fall into that fiscal or to austerity trap.
I want to pick up on the skills subject, because it's come up a lot, but just before I do the other two panelists agree with that? Would the worst decision of the government be to try and return to some kind of fiscal constraint? Martin, why don't you go first?
Well, the worst is a tall order. There are a lot of really bad choices the government could make, but it would definitely be a candidate. It would be disastrous to go for a sort of austerity drive. There's no need for it, and it's counterproductive. And it's particularly counterproductive in terms of leveling up. I mean, we saw that the cuts in the previous round tended to hit already worse situated areas more, because they depended more on the public services and the local authority services, whose funding was most steeply cut. So, if you give me some time, maybe I can think of something even more disastrous. But yeah, no, that it would be a terrible mistake.
It can be your next piece. So I want to come back to skills, and it again sort of reflects one of the questions. And the question was a version of, haven't we all been here before? Haven't we all tried this before? This is not the first attempt at this kind of regional policy. And from my background, I spent a lot of my career doing skills and education policy. You could argue that was definitely true for this, right? We have spent large amounts on educational investment in various forms over the decades. We've had lots of skills attempts to reskill populations that are at high risk of disruption. There have been well-documented cases in America. There's a wonderful book called Janesville I'd recommend everyone read if they haven't already, which basically looks at a post-industrial town that lost its GM plant and people tried to retrain and it didn't work because the jobs weren't there, and or at least we think the jobs weren't there. I'm happy for the panelists to either address skills specifically or go broader. But what is it that can be different this time, given that there have been reasonably substantial, relatively high spending attempts to either increase skilled levels in underrepresented areas or generally improve regional productivity? What is going to be different this time? Catherine, why don't I come to you first this time? And then I'll go to Charlie and then Martin.
So the best thing to make things better is always to find out what actually went wrong in the last time. So I don't know this exactly what the mistakes of the past were, but I think it would be probably very good to go deeper into the matter. As I said, particularly for further education, the case is simply that people don't access it even though they could it. So the whole problem is not the money, but all the institutions behind. And this could equally have been a problem. Then for sure, the focus should be on needs too. So places which are really deprived and where really the needs are the highest should get more attention. When we look at some funds issued by the government, I'm not always sure whether they really are so needs focused. So this is one thing. And then another point, making the money and means available, as Martin has mentioned, austerity must be stopped. So, and also go into social service provision, which is not only education, but the whole surrounding, like looking at disadvantaged youth, etc., which are maybe could get some of the funds or the support, but can't because they are so concerned with other things going on in their lives, should also get in support, which is like accompanying the skills support by, like, I don't know, social service provision, particularly tailored for these kind of people.
Okay, Catherine, thank you. And Charlie?
So it's a great question. You could think of the establishment of the University of York in 1963 as part of a program of establishing new universities in places that didn't.
And that one was a triumphant success, so we should repeat it many times.
Lots of places around the country got a university, and what happened? Well, they produced brilliant graduates, and then they went to London to work. They didn't stay. And to an extent, we still have that problem now. London sucks in skills, which reinforces the problem in the first place. But there are examples where things have worked, not necessarily because of very overt government action, but generally speaking, because of university education. I think the Grand Rapids example Martin talked about was one of them. I was in Edinburgh before I came to York, and Edinburgh has transformed itself from a rather sleepy place focused on tourism and glorious architecture and stuff like that to one of the most dynamic tech centres in Europe. And it kind of happened without people noticing. And it basically happened because there was a brilliant computer science department at the university, which over time saw its graduates going out into the local economy, founding companies, saw over time traditional industries like finance adopting some of those innovations, over time saw startups growing into unicorns. And nobody had kind of thought about it as an ecosystem which might be amenable to policy intervention. It grew up. I think there's a lesson from that. Well, how did it grow up? What are the components of that? Can you reproduce those components in other places? It's certainly a set of lessons I've taken with me here to York, and thinking about how you can get those components. Brilliant place to live, yeah. It's fantastic graduate skills, and I think the graduate skills are things that we perhaps have typically underestimated. It's that dynamic research base, but it's the accumulation over time of those companies in and around the university, existing and new, which well, hey presto, suddenly you've got a fantastic cluster which produces a comparative advantage. Again, can we get government to think in a more subtle way, which recognises these processes where they've happened, and do sensible things to help reproduce them?
I mean, I think that's very interesting. Certainly, Martin will know much more, but all of the sort of Rust Belt revival stories that I've seen have centered on very high R&D potential, usually from a university. There may be exceptions, which you can talk about, but it does seem to be the common story. Martin.
Yeah, I just want to follow up really on the really interesting things that have been said, because skills are clearly essential. And let's not only talk about higher and further education, but just very, very basic skills. Catherine touched on this, but I mean, basic numeracy and literacy and now digital competence is essential, and too many people don't have it still. And Britain performs poorly there. You know, something as simple as just putting your money where your mouth is. The countries that have the highest achievement on those sorts of basic digital or numeracy, literacy, digital, the Nordics, for example, are the ones that spend the largest share of GDP on all levels of education. You just have to spend money on it. It's an investment and you have to spend money on it. But as your example, the Janesville example shows, and as Charlie said, you can give people skills and then they move if the jobs aren't there. So really, you need to have a very active policy to really bring jobs there. I mean, easy to say and very hard to do. One thing I want to kind of extract and emphasize from what Charlie said, there's a difference between university teaching and university research. And you can see this in some of the empirical literature I've looked at in economics. Having, adding a university somewhere that teaches people, it can be a very good teaching university, doesn't do anything for the economic development of the area because people leave and use their skills in other places. What you want are research institutions. And I think the Edinburgh example is a good one. I suspect, I'm just guessing here, but I suspect Edinburgh also got some of its mojo from being, after devolution, a new administrative center and political center. That kind of adds to the hive of activity. It adds more jobs for highly educated, high-skilled people. And maybe there's a lesson there in terms of within England how to devolve more powers to lower levels of government. But what the examples that work show, I think, is you have, in some way or other, you manage to start with a critical mass of these good modern jobs, maybe through a research university, maybe through a research institution that isn't a university, that can link in with local companies, always pretty much with some quite active and smart local government working joined up, as Charlie said, with central government strategy. So all of these pieces need to be in place at the same time. Now, how do you think about that as a policymaker in Westminster? I suppose the way you think about it is to try to set up a framework where you can encourage and reward those different components. And perhaps, a way to think about it is to say, look, we are going to pick 10 places that, qualify as in need of leveling up. And we're going to see we're going to ask local places to see, do you have the sort of local dynamism, local ideas that we could come in with resources for, find private sector partners for, and actually make this kind of switch from a vicious cycle to a virtuous cycle. It's very, it's visionary in both the good sense and the bad sense. It could completely fail. But I don't think anything else can really succeed. It's not an entirely appropriate example, but think about the Docklands redevelopment. It's in London, of course, but it was that sort of quite ambitious project with the private sector, with the government. And it's worked. All of East London has been transformed, not just by that, but by people with high skills and high salaries wanting to live in Hackney, for example, where I live. So that's the sort of way we have to think in other places too. Much harder, but that's what we have to do.
So just picking up on this, and one of the questions asked about the Preston model as a sort of method for levelling up. I don't know how familiar you all are with the Preston model, but one answer to how does Westminster do this could be Westminster cannot do this. This has to be something that is fundamentally locally driven, and that the joined up government problem is a problem precisely because we're trying to do it over 65 million people, rather than in a relatively small country like a Nordic country or a more localized area. What's the view of the panel? Is this credibly done without more local ownership? And Charlie, one of the things that I'm very interested in is the sort of change of the university over time from these very often civic institutions, not York perhaps, but sort of certainly the 19th century red bricks, which were very locally owned and driven, to these more national institutions, partly as national power kind of coalesced. So is this plausibly done by a Westminster government, at least in the medium term, or does it have to be localized? Charlie, I'll go to you first.
The UK is a very strange place in the structure of its government and the level of centralisation, however you measure it. And I do think that is a long-term structural problem. You mentioned the Preston example. I probably know too little about it, but it sounds compelling. And it sounds very appealing, but it's quite small scale, and that may be an advantage for an experiment in community wealth building, but it may not be the basis for a more ambitious program. But once you get to the kind of agglomerations that have had some measure of devolution, in and around Manchester, for example, Leeds is now in the earlier stages of that. They make real sense as places in which you can do some of that coordination, assuming central government gives up some of the levers of power and enables taxation to be raised in some form or other locally, where you can build the join up across sectors, institutions, where you can work with a sense of shared common purpose, which is very, very difficult to ordain from Whitehall. So I'm certainly in favour of the potential of devolution to local decision-making structures, which bring that possibility of local mobilisation, which become an ecosystem in action. It doesn't always work out, of course, and there are plenty of devolved jurisdictions in other countries which are not successful despite the apparent attractions of that kind of model. It has to have really effective leadership capable of building that shared purpose.
Charlie, thank you. And Katrine, I mean, Germany obviously is an example of much more devolved power. What's your view?
Yeah, I mean, at the Centre for Cities, we are very much in favor of more devolution, because a lot of the policy we were talking about or thinking about, which can actually deliver levelling up, is local transport planning, certain times also skills, etc. Public services, they can probably better delivered at the much more local level. And at the moment in the UK, we see that is a problem, not only because, yeah, I mean, so there's so much power in the central government, because also if there are powers, they are like scattered around like a lot of different local authorities in different types of intersections, etc. So I think the first thing which needs to happen is actually, yeah, to make clear cut and first, yeah, better match the powers a certain place should have to the geography. And that would also mean that you reduce, it's maybe not everywhere such a popular opinion, but in our opinion, it does mean reduce the number of local authorities from actually more than 300 to 69, where all of these local authorities have like an elected mayor and get like very specific powers. So that would also mean that exactly these kind of local authorities would need to build up a certain institutional capacity, because I think the comparison to Germany is already always made, but the reason is why everything is working so well is the institutions are there, and this like since, I don't know, decades. So building up really the institutions for the local authorities which are responsible for a certain area and have the according powers will be very important. And for sure, then the aspect Charlie already mentioned, it's like giving them the right funding and financing mechanism to raise their own money for the community. So they should get more powers on where to spend the budget they've got, and were also like able to keep certain fees or like money they raised and to do with it what they want.
Thank you. And Martin.
I'll be very quick because I agree with pretty much everything that's been said. I just want to add one or two points. Clearly, there needs to be more power and more resources at more local level, local and regional, maybe. That doesn't mean that Westminster can't do it. It still has a big role, partly because what works depends also on how, how the country fits together. Transport networks, for example, the tax structure. I would think it'd be better for leveling up if you just scrapped council tax and business rates and let localities keep more of income tax, for example. But these are things that have to be done at a national level, those sorts of decisions. And that's why you need to, you need to do it in sync. You need both, right? You need more local power and you need smarter central involvement. The UK does have an over-centralization problem, at least in England. But I think that one can also ask questions about the quality of the way the central authority is used, the quality of policymaking in Westminster, which is a separate question from how centralized it is.
Thank you. So I am conscious that we are almost out of time. I've tried to weave in as many of the questions from the participants as I can. There were many brilliant ones I couldn't get to. But just before we finish, and this is such an enormous area, we sort of skipped over every imaginable, well, not every imaginable topic. Many topics are still left, many unsaid. So a final question, which echoes my first, which is, if you wanted to see that the government was serious about levelling up, say in this autumn's spending review, what would signal that to you? What's the one thing that you would want to see? And I will go to Katrine first, if I may.
So what we like to see is, like, first, what exactly do they mean with leveling up? And you, Rachel, brought it into the discussion, etc. But we want to see a commitment of the government and a clear definition what it means. And also, this should be connected to targets and like a timeline when these targets or objectives are actually reached. And I think it basically should be based around the topics I've mentioned, like broadly focusing on like three focus areas: life expectancy, skills, as well as productivity, and then really assign where which bodies and which parts of the country should reach the objectives when. I think this would be very much appreciated.
Thank you. Admirably concise and clear answer. Thank you. Martin.
I think I would like to see a bit more honesty and integrity and some real meaningful numbers. And on honesty and integrity, I have in mind things like, don't assign, don't make formulas that will happen to give the money you give to the sort of Tory marginals that you need to get support from, but actually have something that's clearly objective and can be trusted by everyone. So that's one thing. Be honest that probably SMEs in smaller places are the ones who've suffered the most from the hard Brexit, because it's much harder to export at small scale to Europe now. So be honest about these things and then show that you're serious about addressing them. And I think that means putting in much more money, committing much more money for the longer term. And try to set up some sort of structure that will give these local political levels much more say and influence. And it doesn't have to be everywhere. Probably you can't do it for everywhere. You have to find some way of being selective. But something that communicates to local leaders that we will put resources, we'll make resources, serious resources available if you come up with something that we believe can work for you. We will put the resources in, we will work with business, something that looks like a proper plan, as opposed to kind of little initiatives sprinkled around here and there.
And Charlie, the last word goes to you.
Thank you very much. We were talking about the devolution of power and resources. I think that has to be part of it, to nurture a collective capability in places which aren't in the southeast. And a shift in the balance of public expenditure. In particular, and Martin made this point on infrastructure. one of the most important things that the government could do in terms of levelling up is to build a high-speed railway line from the west of the north of England to the east of the north of England. That should be the #1 priority. It's much more important than getting people even more quickly to London, which appears to be the priority in terms of rail infrastructure investment. So get serious about real infrastructure investment outside of the southeast of England.
Everyone, thank you. Thank you for a stellar panel. It really did feel like we scratched the surface, but fantastic contributions. Thank you to the audience for listening, contributing all of your questions. Thank you to the festival for putting on this event. I hope everyone has a fantastic day. If you would like to purchase Martin's book, I am told that it is available through Fox Lane Books, through the Festival of Ideas, and you can always check their website for more details on events, including one tomorrow at 1 p.m, which will continue this theme. So thank you so much again, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful evening in the sun, and we will see you again soon. And you can always watch back on the recording online. Thank you. Bye.